What if I told you the lush beauty of South Florida's real estate market is secretly eroding, not from a housing bubble, but from saltwater? The Everglades' degradation is a silent assailant on your property values, causing widespread vulnerability. Are you aware of how saltwater intrusion and compromised water management are directly impacting your financial future in South Florida? This isn't speculation. It's an environmental crisis already manifesting in property devaluations, skyrocketing insurance premiums, and fundamental threats to the region's water supply. According to a groundbreaking study by the Everglades Foundation, America's Everglades contributes over $31 billion annually to the economy through ecosystem services, including $9.2 billion in real estate enhancement alone. But as this critical ecosystem collapses, so does the foundation supporting South Florida's property values. Salt water is seeping into freshwater aquifers at an alarming rate. Coastal wells are becoming unusable, agricultural lands are turning barren, and the financial implications for millions of homeowners and investors are only beginning to emerge. In this deep dive, we're exposing how the Everglades ecological siege is becoming South Florida's greatest real estate liability. Subscribe to Housing Intel for data-driven insights that could protect your most valuable investment. The Everglades has been called Florida's irreplaceable river of grass, a vast wetland ecosystem spanning over 1.5 million acres that once stretched from Lake Okeechobee to Florida Bay. For over a century, this natural wonder has been the lifeblood of South Florida, filtering water, recharging aquifers, and providing drinking water to over 8 million residents. The fresh water flowing across the Everglades recharges the Biscayne Aquifer, which serves as the primary drinking water source for the entire southeastern coast of Florida. Without this natural filtration and recharge system, the region's water supply would be fundamentally compromised. But decades of human intervention have severed the natural flow. Florida's water system was altered to prevent flooding, but at the cost of cutting off the Everglades' lifeblood. Canals, levees, and water control structures redirected water that once flowed south through the ecosystem. The result? The Everglades of today is less than half its original size and has lost over 70% of its water flow. The ecosystem that millions depend on has been suffocating for generations. And now, the consequences are no longer invisible. They're showing up in real estate valuations, insurance premiums, and the long-term viability of coastal properties. The first tremors of trouble appeared subtly. Water levels in certain areas began fluctuating unpredictably. Wildlife populations started shifting inland, away from traditional habitats. Wetlands that once thrived with sawgrass and wading birds began transforming into open water. These weren't just environmental curiosities. They were warning signs of systemic failure. Scientists monitoring the Everglades noticed something alarming. Saltwater was creeping inland, both through rivers and underground through the porous limestone beneath South Florida. This phenomenon, known as saltwater intrusion, occurs when seawater advances into freshwater aquifers, driven by factors including overextraction from aquifers, urbanization, and rising sea levels. As freshwater flows diminished, there wasn't enough pressure to push saltwater back out to sea. The balance that had existed for millennia was breaking. In coastal communities, wells that had provided fresh water for decades suddenly started showing elevated chloride levels. Agricultural areas near the coast reported crop failures from saline irrigation water. And property owners began noticing something strange. Vegetation dying without explanation, wells going brackish, and soil becoming less productive. These were the initial signs of a crisis that would eventually threaten the entire South Florida real estate market. The mechanics of saltwater intrusion are deceptively simple, but devastatingly effective. South Florida sits atop the Biscayne Aquifer, a shallow groundwater system composed of highly porous limestone. Under normal conditions, fresh water from the Everglades flows through this aquifer, creating pressure that keeps salt water at bay along the coast. But as the Everglades has been drained and diverted, that freshwater pressure has diminished. Salt water, being denser than fresh water, naturally pushes inland through the porous rock, contaminating the aquifer from below. According to a 2025 report issued by the South Florida Water Management District, during the last 5 years, salt water has pushed even further inland underground across the region. The data is alarming. In Hallandale Beach, the saltwater interface has shifted inland by over 1 mile since 2019. Fort Lauderdale has experienced similar intrusion, with saltwater advancing approximately 1 mile into areas that were once freshwater zones. But the most shocking finding comes from Davie, where the aquifer has experienced a staggering 4-mile inward shift in just 6 years. These aren't projections or worst-case scenarios. This is documented reality, measured by over 1,000 monitoring wells across Broward, Martin, Palm Beach, and St. Lucie counties. The saltwater interface is dynamic, moving constantly in response to rainfall, well field pumpage, and sea level rise. Recent data shows chloride levels in aquifers have risen from 250 milligrams per liter in the late 1990s to 600 milligrams per liter in 2024. Wells in Hallandale and West Palm Beach now exceed 10,000 milligrams per liter of chloride. For context, ocean water contains approximately 19,000 milligrams per liter. A well in Boynton Beach registered 16,050 milligrams per liter, making it nearly half as salty as ocean water. Once salt water enters wells, making them saline, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. This creates an existential threat for properties dependent on well water. The evidence from the ground is undeniable and devastating. Affected wells are being abandoned across coastal communities, forcing municipalities and property owners to seek alternative water sources at enormous expense. Moving wells is expensive, with costs ranging from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars depending on depth and location. Agricultural operations are facing particularly brutal impacts. Saltwater intrusion influences the agricultural industry by harming the productivity of crops and threatening soil health. Studies show that soil health is negatively affected by saltwater intrusion and salinity, with damages potentially mitigated only through intensive and costly management practices. Farmers in southern Miami-Dade County and parts of the Everglades agricultural area report crop failures, reduced yields, and the need to abandon certain fields entirely as salinity levels render them unusable. The visual evidence is equally stark. In areas where saltwater has intruded, native freshwater vegetation is dying and being replaced by salt-tolerant species or simply collapsing into open water. The Everglades marshes, often referred to as a river of grass, are transforming. Sawgrass and other marsh plants that define the ecosystem require freshwater pulses during the wet season to survive. Without adequate freshwater flow, saltwater advances and the marshes die. Between 2009 and 2019, saltwater intruded about 1 mile inland in parts of the Fort Lauderdale area, causing visible ecosystem collapse. Property owners in these transitional zones are watching their land values erode as environmental degradation becomes impossible to ignore. Case studies of early real estate impacts reveal a troubling pattern. Properties in low-lying coastal areas that depend on private wells are already facing challenges from compromised water quality. Homes in parts of Hallandale Beach, Davie, and West Palm Beach have experienced well contamination requiring expensive remediation or connection to municipal water systems. The cost to connect a single property to municipal water can range from $5,000 to $20,000 or more, depending on distance from existing infrastructure. For rural properties or agricultural land, these costs multiply exponentially, but the impact extends beyond individual wells. Properties in areas with documented saltwater intrusion are beginning to face disclosure requirements during sales transactions. Buyers are increasingly aware of the issue and demanding inspections, water quality tests, and environmental assessments before purchasing. This is creating a two-tier market: properties in zones with confirmed freshwater stability versus those in threatened zones showing signs of intrusion. The price differential is already emerging, with properties in saltwater-affected areas selling at discounts ranging from 5 to 15% compared to similar properties in unaffected zones. Real estate agents in South Florida confirm that saltwater intrusion is becoming a significant factor in property valuations, particularly for waterfront and agricultural properties. Appraisers are beginning to factor in environmental risks when assessing long-term value. And mortgage lenders are taking notice, with some requiring additional environmental certifications for properties in high-risk zones. This is just the beginning. As saltwater continues its inland march, the circle of affected properties will expand dramatically. The domino effect of habitat loss extends far beyond environmental aesthetics. As saltwater intrusion causes freshwater marshes to collapse, the entire ecosystem begins to unravel. The Everglades supports iconic species including the Florida panther, American alligator, roseate spoonbill, and West Indian manatee. But these species don't exist in isolation. They're part of an intricate web of interdependencies. When marsh plants die from saltwater exposure, they can no longer filter phosphorus and other nutrients from water flowing through the system. This loss of natural filtration means more nutrients flow downstream, contaminating aquifers and causing harmful algal blooms in coastal waters. These blooms devastate fish populations, kill manatees, and render beaches unusable. The economic consequences are staggering. Harmful algal blooms in 2013 and 2018 caused over $3 billion in losses to real estate and tourism in just 2 Florida counties. Red tide events shut down fishing, close beaches, and drive away tourists who form the backbone of coastal economies. Property values in areas affected by repeated algal blooms have documented declines, with some waterfront properties losing 10 to 20% of their value during major bloom events. The loss of biodiversity also impacts flood protection. Healthy wetlands act as natural sponges, absorbing storm surge and reducing flooding during hurricanes. As these wetlands collapse, coastal properties lose this critical buffer. The result is increased flood risk, higher insurance premiums, and greater vulnerability to storm damage. Properties that once enjoyed natural protection now face existential threats from extreme weather events. Beyond aesthetics, the economic value of a healthy Everglades ecosystem is monumental. According to the Everglades Foundation's groundbreaking 2025 study, the Everglades provides over $31.5 billion annually in ecosystem services. This includes $9.2 billion in real estate enhancement, $8.5 billion in outdoor recreation, $8.4 billion in protection from extreme weather events, and $3.3 billion in biodiversity and habitat support. Over the next 50 years, the Everglades is valued at more than $1 trillion in ecosystem services. These aren't abstract environmental calculations. They represent real economic activity that directly supports property values, tourism revenue, and regional prosperity. The outdoor recreation economy alone employs tens of thousands of people in fishing, boating, wildlife viewing, and ecotourism. Florida Bay, fed by the Everglades, supports a commercial fishing industry worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually. When the ecosystem degrades, this economic engine sputters. Commercial fisheries collapse. tourist destinations lose their appeal, and the communities that depend on this economic activity suffer devastating consequences. Property values in areas dependent on ecosystem-based tourism and recreation face direct impacts when environmental quality declines. Waterfront properties marketed for their access to pristine fishing grounds or wildlife viewing lose value when those amenities disappear. The connection between ecosystem health and real estate value is not theoretical. It's measurable, documented, and accelerating. Future projections paint an increasingly dire picture for coastal property values. As habitat degradation continues, multiple forces will converge to devalue prime coastal real estate. First, the expansion of saltwater intrusion zones will affect an ever-growing number of properties. Current projections suggest that without significant intervention, the saltwater interface could advance another 2 to 5 miles inland over the next 2 decades in vulnerable areas. This would potentially affect hundreds of thousands of properties currently considered safe. Second, the loss of natural storm protection from degraded wetlands will increase flood insurance requirements and costs for coastal properties. FEMA flood zone designations are likely to expand, capturing properties previously outside high-risk areas. This will trigger mandatory flood insurance for mortgaged properties, adding thousands of dollars in annual costs. Third, the continued degradation of water quality and ecosystem services will diminish the recreational and aesthetic value that has driven South Florida's real estate premium. Properties marketed for waterfront lifestyle, fishing access, and natural beauty will face fundamental challenges as these amenities degrade or disappear. Real estate analysts project that properties in high-risk zones could experience cumulative value declines of 20 to 40% over the next decade if current trends continue. This isn't alarmism. It's based on documented patterns from other coastal areas that have experienced similar environmental degradation. The most vulnerable properties include waterfront homes in low-lying areas, agricultural land near the coast, and properties dependent on private wells in intrusion zones. But the ripple effects will extend much further inland as the ecosystem continues to collapse. The delicate dance of water management in South Florida has never been more precarious. The Everglades functions as the region's water tower, capturing, filtering, and storing fresh water that millions depend on for drinking, agriculture, and industrial use. But this system has been compromised by over a century of drainage, diversion, and development. The South Florida Water Management District operates an incredibly complex system of canals, levees, pump stations, and water control structures, attempting to balance flood control, water supply, environmental needs, and agricultural demands. It's a nearly impossible juggling act that grows more difficult as climate change intensifies wet and dry extremes. During wet seasons, excess water is often discharged to the ocean rather than being stored or sent south through the Everglades, wasting precious freshwater resources. During dry seasons, there isn't enough water to maintain the Everglades ecosystem or provide adequate pressure to prevent saltwater intrusion. The result is a system perpetually in crisis mode, never achieving the balance needed for long-term sustainability. The comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, passed by Congress in 2000, includes 68 infrastructure projects designed to restore more natural water flow. But progress has been slow, funding inconsistent, and many critical projects face delays. The Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir, described as the largest environmental restoration project in the world, aims to capture and store water to be released south during dry periods. When completed, it will help recharge aquifers and push back saltwater intrusion. But completion remains years away, and the crisis intensifies daily. Without functional water management that prioritizes ecosystem health, the Everglades cannot perform its critical role supporting South Florida's water supply and property values. The cost of adaptation is astronomical and accelerating. As freshwater sources become compromised by saltwater intrusion and ecosystem degradation, municipalities are being forced to invest billions in alternative water infrastructure. Desalination plants, which remove salt from seawater to create potable water, cost hundreds of millions of dollars to construct and tens of millions annually to operate. Enhanced water treatment facilities capable of handling higher contamination levels require similar investments. These costs are ultimately passed to residents through higher water bills and property taxes. In areas where municipal water systems must be extended to serve properties losing well water to saltwater intrusion, the infrastructure costs run into tens of millions per project. Property owners face connection fees, impact fees, and ongoing higher water bills compared to well water. For agricultural operations, the costs are even more severe. Farmers facing saltwater intrusion must invest in expensive mitigation practices, including soil amendments, drainage improvements, and conversion to more salt-tolerant crops that may be less profitable. Many operations find these adaptations economically unfeasible and are forced to abandon agricultural use entirely, converting land to other purposes or selling at a loss. The cumulative adaptation costs for South Florida are projected to reach tens of billions of dollars over the coming decades. These expenses represent deadweight on the regional economy, diverting resources that could drive growth into defensive measures simply maintaining current functionality. And these costs flow directly into property values as higher operating expenses, taxes, and infrastructure fees make property ownership more expensive and less attractive to buyers and investors. The uninsurable future is already arriving for South Florida's most vulnerable properties. Climate risk has fundamentally changed how insurance companies assess and price policies in coastal areas. Property insurance premiums in Florida have surged dramatically, with some homeowners seeing increases of 60% or more since 2022. In Cape Coral and other flood-prone areas, annual insurance costs now range from $8,000 to $12,000 for properties in high-risk zones. Some major insurance carriers have withdrawn from the Florida market entirely, leaving homeowners scrambling for coverage through high-risk state pools that charge premium rates. The same pattern affects flood insurance, windstorm coverage, and even liability policies that factor in environmental risks. For properties in areas with documented saltwater intrusion, ecosystem degradation, or high climate vulnerability, insurance is becoming prohibitively expensive or simply unavailable. This creates a cascade of consequences for property values. When insurance becomes unaffordable, properties become effectively uninhabitable for most buyers. Mortgage lenders require insurance as a condition of financing, so uninsurable properties become cash-only purchases, dramatically shrinking the buyer pool. Even cash buyers are increasingly reluctant to acquire properties facing long-term environmental threats without insurance protection. The result is a growing class of stranded assets, properties with diminishing value, limited marketability, and uncertain futures. Real estate professionals report that mortgage eligibility is already being affected in vulnerable areas, with lenders requiring additional environmental certifications, higher down payments, or simply declining to finance certain properties. This is creating a two-tier mortgage market: properties in low-risk areas with standard financing availability, and properties in high-risk zones facing restricted or unavailable financing. This bifurcation is one of the clearest leading indicators of long-term value divergence. Identifying the hotspots most vulnerable to Everglades degradation requires looking at multiple overlapping risk factors. The highest risk areas combine low elevation, proximity to the coast, dependence on aquifer water, and direct connection to degraded ecosystem services. Based on ecological data and saltwater intrusion monitoring, several zones emerge as particularly threatened. The southeastern coastal corridor from Homestead through Miami-Dade into southern Broward County faces acute risk from saltwater intrusion, advancing inland, and loss of Everglades-dependent water supply. Areas including Hallandale Beach, Aventura, North Miami Beach, and parts of Fort Lauderdale show documented intrusion with projections for continued advancement. Properties in these zones, particularly those below 10 feet elevation or dependent on shallow wells, face the highest near-term risk. The southwestern coastal areas including Naples, Marco Island, and Cape Coral face similar threats compounded by insurance crisis and flood risk. The Picayune Strand Restoration Project aims to restore wetlands and improve water supply in this region, but properties remain highly vulnerable until restoration is complete. The Everglades agricultural area, located south of Lake Okeechobee, faces threats from both saltwater intrusion affecting irrigation water and loss of soil quality from subsidence and degradation. Agricultural properties in this zone may become economically unviable within 1 to 2 decades without significant intervention. Low-lying inland areas dependent on Everglades water flows for flood protection and aquifer recharge also face medium to high risk. As the ecosystem's capacity to absorb and filter water diminishes, these areas will experience increased flooding, degraded water quality, and higher operating costs. Real estate investors and homeowners can access saltwater intrusion maps published by the South Florida Water Management District showing monitoring well data and intrusion trends. Properties near monitoring wells showing high chloride levels or rapid intrusion advancement should be considered high risk. Elevation data combined with flood zone maps provide additional risk assessment tools. Properties below 5 feet elevation face particularly acute long-term vulnerability. The financial implications for homeowners and investors are profound and multi-layered. For current homeowners in affected areas, the primary concern is diminished resale value and increased holding costs. Properties experiencing environmental degradation sell at discounts compared to similar properties in unaffected areas. This discount ranges from 5 to 20%, depending on severity and visibility of the issues. Time on market increases significantly, with properties in high-risk zones sitting unsold for 90 days or more, compared to 30 to 45 days in stable markets. Holding costs are rising through higher insurance premiums, potential special assessments for water infrastructure, increased water bills, and property tax increases needed to fund regional adaptation measures. For properties requiring connection to municipal water or other remediation, one-time costs can range from $10,000 to $50,000. These expenses directly reduce net proceeds when selling and make ownership more expensive in the interim. For real estate investors, the calculus is even more challenging. Rental properties face the same increased costs, but must remain competitively priced to attract tenants. This compresses margins and reduces cash flow. Properties purchased for appreciation are particularly vulnerable, as long-term value projections must now factor in significant environmental risk that didn't exist in previous decades. Cap rates in high-risk areas are rising as investors demand higher returns to compensate for increased risk, which further depresses property values. Fix and flip investors face challenges selling renovated properties in affected areas as buyers become more sophisticated about environmental risks. Even beautifully renovated homes face pricing resistance when located in saltwater intrusion zones or areas vulnerable to ecosystem collapse. The smartest investors are already repositioning portfolios away from high-risk coastal areas and into properties with better long-term environmental stability. Those who fail to recognize these trends face potential catastrophic losses as the full scale of Everglades degradation manifests in real estate markets over the coming decade. There is a path forward, but it requires both individual action and collective commitment to Everglades restoration. For individual property owners and investors, the first step is thorough due diligence. Before purchasing any property in South Florida, demand comprehensive environmental assessments, including water quality testing, saltwater intrusion risk analysis, elevation certification, and flood zone verification. Review local saltwater intrusion monitoring data from the South Florida Water Management District. Understand the property's water source and its vulnerability. Factor in climate risk and insurance availability for the long term, not just current conditions. Consider properties in higher elevation areas, further inland, or with documented freshwater stability. Avoid properties dependent on private wells in documented intrusion zones unless prepared for significant remediation costs. For current owners in vulnerable areas, consider proactive adaptation measures including connecting to municipal water before required, implementing water conservation practices to reduce aquifer stress, supporting local environmental restoration efforts, and maintaining comprehensive documentation of property conditions for future disclosure requirements. Advocate for adequate property insurance and shop multiple carriers to find the best available coverage. On the collective level, supporting Everglades restoration is not just environmental activism. It's economic self-interest for anyone with South Florida real estate exposure. The comprehensive Everglades restoration plan requires consistent state and federal funding to complete critical projects, including the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir, water treatment areas, and flow restoration infrastructure. Residents and property owners should support politicians and policies that prioritize restoration funding, streamline project approvals, and accelerate implementation timelines. Participate in public comment periods for water management decisions. Support land conservation efforts that protect watershed areas. Rehabilitating degraded wetlands, allowing more fresh water to flow throughout the Everglades ecosystem, reducing freshwater use on lawns and crops, and reusing municipal water for outdoor needs can all help keep South Florida's drinking water safe and property values stable for generations. This is something everyone can contribute to, and everyone with property in the region has a direct financial stake in the outcome. The Everglades under siege is not just an environmental story. It's a real estate crisis unfolding in slow motion that will reshape South Florida's property landscape over the coming decades. Saltwater intrusion is advancing inland mile by mile, year by year, contaminating wells and rendering land unusable. Habitat loss is eliminating the ecosystem services worth over $31 billion annually that support property values, tourism, and regional prosperity. Compromised water management is forcing billions in adaptation costs onto property owners and taxpayers while failing to address the root causes of ecosystem collapse. Insurance is becoming unaffordable or unavailable for properties in the highest risk zones, restricting financing and crushing property values. The most vulnerable areas, low-lying coastal communities, agricultural lands, and properties dependent on threatened aquifer water, face value declines of 20 to 40% or more over the next decade if current trends continue. But knowledge is power, and informed property owners can navigate this crisis, avoid the worst affected areas, and support restoration efforts that protect their investments. The lush beauty of South Florida's real estate market is built on the foundation of a healthy Everglades ecosystem. As that foundation crumbles, so does the long-term viability of coastal property values. This isn't speculation or environmental alarmism. It's documented reality measured in chloride levels, property discounts, insurance premiums, and billions of dollars in lost economic value. If this deep dive opened your eyes to risks you weren't aware of, smash that like button right now. Subscribe to Housing Intel for data-driven real estate intelligence that goes beyond surface-level market reports to expose the fundamental forces reshaping property values across America. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss analysis like this. Drop a comment below. Were you aware of how severely Everglades degradation is impacting South Florida real estate? Are you buying, selling, or waiting in these markets? We read every comment and use your feedback to guide future coverage. Because sometimes, understanding the environmental foundation beneath your property is the most important real estate analysis of all.